Hi, everyone. Welcome to Big Green Conversations. Today's topic is building a resilience in a pandemic. My name is Katerina Daja. I'm a member of the class of 2021, a psychology major, and on the women's ice hockey team. So let's get started by introducing our panelists. First, I'd like to welcome Sarah Stearns from the class of 1990. At Dartmouth, Sarah majored in psychology and competed on the women's volleyball team. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kentucky. For 9 years, she worked as an assistant professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and directed the group's program in child psychiatry. Today, Dr. Stearns is in private practice working with children and parents in both school and office settings. Welcome, Sarah. Our next panelist is Jordan Fields from the class of 2006. Jordan majored in psychology at Dartmouth and was a cornerback on the football team. After Dartmouth, he received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Memphis and now serves as a major in the United States Air Force. While in the Air Force, he has been embedded as an operational psychologist, designing and implementing performance enhancement programs. Thank you for joining us, Jordan. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Mackenzie St. Onge from the class of 2017. Mac is a former member of both the women's ice hockey and women's rugby teams. She majored in psychology, and her experiences in both athletics and academics sparked a passion for personal development through sport. That passion led to her creation of the Sideline Perspective, an online community for sidelined athletes to share stories, find community, and move forward with purpose. Welcome, Mac, and I look forward to speaking with all of you today. So let's get started. Our first question this evening is just to give everyone a little bit more background on your Dartmouth experiences. So what role did Dartmouth and being a student athlete have on your career paths? Sarah, would you like to start?
Okay, can you hear me now? We're good? Okay. So I was a psychology major, but I don't think at that time I really knew I was going to become a psychologist. I picked it. I did well in my first classes. I enjoyed it. I found it interesting. I think it was really when I took a war peace studies course and learned more about trauma. And we had some readings about Vietnam. And I was really fascinated by how people went through adverse experience, but somehow picked up and moved on, and what were the differences between the people who did and who didn't. So that sort of piqued my interest then. But, you know, there were many things that I studied at Dartmouth and was interested in. So I don't know, I think it just sort of made me a well-rounded individual that found other people interesting, and I met lots of new people at Dartmouth.
Thank you for sharing. Jordan, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I think my experience was similar to Sarah's in that I was a psychology major. I actually started off as a computer science major and found that I could not do the time of putting together programs and doing football. It just didn't work for the type of schedule that I wanted to have and the type of college experience that I wanted to have. So I had taken a psychology course and really enjoyed it. So I kind of pursued psychology in Arabic. I actually was planning on going into the CIA, but an injury that I got while I was at Dartmouth kind of dissuaded me from that direction. I was ROTC, which was a factor in kind of the path that I took. I was Army ROTC. I actually got disqualified from going into the Army because of the injury that I had while I was at Dartmouth. And so that kind of changed my direction from pursuing the CIA. And I decided at that point to kind of focus on psychology and to go for a career within psychology. And a professor that I had my senior year, John Corson, he actually mentored me after I graduated. His wife was a psychiatrist, and he and his wife kind of mentored me as I thought about psychiatry versus psychology and the way that we treat patients and clients. And so I decided to pursue psychology instead.
Thank you. Mac?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that Dartmouth was just the biggest influential factor in where I've gone with my career, a variety of different experiences. So right now I am the manager of athlete career and education with US Ski and Snowboard. So I help the athletes there with all the off snow resources in their life when they're looking at balancing school, getting internships, career after their time competing. And I am really passionate about that work because I feel like being a balanced individual beyond just totally focusing on your sport is so important. Those things that I learned in school as a psych major, but also in some of my sociology classes. So I remember I had one term where I got to take sports, religion, and ethics, as well as a sports and democratization class. And so I just went back and forth from those two during the same term, comparing and contrasting the ideas and being able to look at sport from this totally new angle and the way that it is impacting us as people, raising our next generation within our culture, and just recognizing if it has this much power, we have to be doing it right. And so that really motivated me. And then even beyond then, I spent a good portion of my year after graduation still involved with Dartmouth athletics and around the campus, and my own athlete kind of transition away from hockey, still involved in rugby, but seeing a lot of my class go on and try and navigate who they were beyond their sport. And so obviously those experiences, and I can get into them a little bit later, influence, the creation of the sideline perspective and why I'm passionate about knowing who we are as people as well as who we are as athletes.
Yeah, I think that's really cool how we're all psychology majors and how we all kind of took different paths, but there's still that similarity of being a psych major at Dartmouth and being an athlete at Dartmouth. The next question is, when most of us think about Dartmouth, we think about the strong and supportive community. What role did this community and Dartmouth teach you about building resilience? Jordan, would you like to take this one?
Sure, I'll start. So when I think about kind of the role that Dartmouth had in helping me to develop my resilience, I think about two things in particular. So when I entered Dartmouth, I was particularly shy, and I don't think anybody nowadays who meets me would classify me as shy, but I was very shy. And I think that I was surrounded by a community of people who were very supportive of helping me to understand who I was at the time. And I think that's a really important part of being resilient, because if you don't know who you are and where you are, the skills and the abilities that you have, you really can't develop as well and as efficiently as you'd like to. And so I think that was a big part of it. And the other part was football. So there was a coach that had a particularly important impact on me, and he helped me to understand just how much I could handle in terms of like dealing with pain, dealing with injuries, of which I had many while I was at Dartmouth, and really helped me to realize that I could push through a lot of things that I wasn't pushing through before. And so kind of learning that difference between injury and pain, pain and injury, and then also kind of learning to be able to push myself further and continue on when previously I probably would have stopped or slowed down. That was a really important aspect of kind of learning how resilient and how it could become more resilient while I was at Dartmouth.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it was my parents told me like athletics and sports is like the greatest classroom of life. And so definitely agree with what you said there. Mac, I know you played on 2 different teams. So would you like to give your perspective on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that my time at Dartmouth, and particularly within the athletics community, taught me that resilience is both a skill and a choice. It's something that you can choose to work on every single day, and that you can grow in, and that's a really empowering feeling. You don't have to feel defeated by the fact that like, oh, okay, I didn't feel completely resilient in one scenario. Well, that was a flexing of that muscle for the next time that you're asked to be resilient, and then it builds off of itself. Personally, like when I came on and I started playing hockey at Dartmouth, I was by no means a star player. I was not a starting forward. And so over the course of 4 years, I really had to work my way up to that playing time and to that role in the team. And some of those days, if you guys can relate, you are an Ivy League student, you are juggling all the time demands of being an athlete on top of that, and you're not necessarily feeling or seeing those rewards of playtime or results in the quantifiable terms. And so that can be a little bit deflating. And so I had people who were in my corner and helped me stick out some of those first years to then be able to go on and be a contributing member and a leader and a captain of the team my upperclassmen years. And I think that was a great example of the ways in which, you know, my strength coach and people within the athletic department were able to kind of instill that resilience and say, I see you, that work that you're doing, it's going to pay off, keep it up. And then I guess to touch briefly on my experience then with rugby, I stepped onto that team and onto that field with no experience in the sport, and just fell in love with it so fast, with the coaches, with the team, with the environment. I think they do a phenomenal job with that, but it was also this totally new mindset of being a beginner again and needing to have patience with myself. And again, showing up day after day and saying, okay, I might not have it yet, but I'm going to keep working at it and honing in that skill, and trusting that work ethic is going to get me there.
Thank you.
Hey, Kat, can I chime in?
Yeah,
Here's
of course.
something that really resonated with me. You talked about kind of being in the process of, you know, working day in, day out, and maybe not necessarily experiencing the improvements or benefits or playing time that you would like to experience. But I think that a big part of resilience is the process, right? Learning to be in the process, learning to stick with the process, and to be persistent in that. I think that learning to do that, and if you can learn to enjoy the process, that'll even enhance it that much more. But I think that learning to be in the process and stick with it is a huge part of learning to be resilient, because a lot of things in life, like a lot of us know, they don't come quickly, they don't come smoothly. There's ups and downs. We have steps that we take back, but learning to kind of stick with it is a huge part.
I would agree that too. In my experience as a volleyball player, when I arrived at Dartmouth as a freshman, volleyball was a club sport. And there was a cadre of women ahead of me who've been working to advance and negotiating with the athletic director and with the powers that be at Dartmouth to try to make it an unfunded varsity. And by my senior year, we achieved that. But I think there were times when we felt that it was really unfair. You know, we were sleeping on the floor of relatives and driving our own van, and, you know, not having a lot of funding, you know, no funding really for, you know, equipment and things like that. So I think we redefining our goals of, you know, why were we playing? We were playing for the love of sport. And, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of glory, you know, a lot of the times, and we were competing against other schools that did have, you know, full funded teams. But I think sometimes redefining what your goal is, and, you know, discovering the love of what you're doing, not necessarily having, the goal isn't always that you're going to be, you know, top of the Ivy League pile, right? But that you're achieving some smaller goals along the way, I think has been helpful as I think of it.
Yeah, something I've definitely learned throughout my years here is that, like, no matter the outcome, you're still, in one way or another, you're getting better. It's like, it doesn't matter if you guys lost that year, or if, I don't know, if you got a bad grade, but maybe you were a really good friend to someone. And so, like, you're improving in one way in your life or another, and just nothing is ever the be all and the end all. And that's just what I've kind of learned in my 3 years here so far. My next question. We're often conditioned to act like we have it all together. We say we're good or fine when asked how we're doing, even if we're anxious, sad, or upset. How do you think we can be more genuine with one another without feeling like a downer? How do we stay positive without falling into the trap of toxic positivity? Mac, would you like to take this one on?
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a tricky one. I think we've all felt ourselves on both sides of this. But personally, in my experience, the times when I've had that little piece of courage in me to answer, you know, I'm actually not doing fine, or I actually need a little bit of help, or to dive into just what might otherwise be an uncomfortable conversation, it's incredible how much the people that I'm speaking to, or how often they've met me where I am in terms of that vulnerability. And they've been able to, step to that level and see me and hear me and potentially even offer up something of their own. And it is uncomfortable for sure, but it's like jumping into, a cold pool for the first time. You just got to have the courage to jump, and then you'll kind of settle into that water and adjust a little bit. So I would just encourage, listeners to find a way to jump sometimes when they feel like there's something on their minds, heavy on their hearts, and trust, your teammates, your friends, the people around you to, meet you where you are and step into that level of vulnerability with you.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to follow up on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it's okay to not be okay, right? I mean, we're living in crazy times right now. And so I think the more open you can be about your struggles, I totally agree with Mac. You're going to get that sort of reciprocity. There's that press. If you've disclosed something, someone's likely going to disclose or share something back. And I feel like that I'll be interested to think about the classes that are going through this together now. Like the relationships that you're building with people are going to be so deep in a different kind of way for having, kind of gone through all this together. And there's, meeting someone at that really genuine level, I think is going to be a cause for a deeper relationship. So I do think we're all conditioned, or, at Dartmouth, everybody's like a high achiever and you've solved all kinds of problems to get there. And you have to sort of have an answer for everything. And I'm here to say you don't, and nobody there does. And particularly now, and I think it's also a moving target. Like some days you feel like you've got it all together, and then other days, you really don't. And that's okay.
Yeah, and I'd love to just follow up too and say, it's about the culture we're creating around it, right? So toxic positivity becomes a culture for a reason, because we feed into it and we participate in it. Well, let's challenge ourselves to counter that culture and to be the person who asks that sincere follow-up question of, hey, I know that you were having a hard time the other day, like have things gotten better, or how else can I support you? I had people in my life when I was going through tough times throughout Dartmouth who were kind of my accountability buddy. It was like, okay, it's been a couple of times we've checked in, probably time to take a next step and chat to somebody, either a professional, or figure out the next step to addressing this, because I don't think any problem is beyond addressing if we can get the right help and we can have the right communication around it. So that follow-up is going to be huge, and it's going to start to bring up some of those stories that we just need to be able to see to feel more comfortable sharing our own often. If we're looking at from the outside in to recognize that everyone's participating in toxic positivity, we're not going to feel like our story has a place there. But if people are starting to speak out and we can find stories that resonate with our own, we're going to be more likely to speak as well.
It's so much easier to carry the burden with two people, right? So all by yourself is a really lonely place to be. And if you don't take the risk and share, like Mac was saying, then you also can't reap the benefit of somebody else saying, yeah, me too, I've had that experience. So.
I'd like to chime in real quick. So kind of from my experience, both as an athlete and in the military, one of the things that I've had to do for the past 7 years in the military is that as an officer, I'm not allowed to have relationships with certain people. Like I'm not allowed to interact on a fully, truly genuine level with people who are considered enlisted. And so that is kind of another level where I literally can be punished for doing so. And so it's interesting thinking about kind of being that genuine version of yourself, but at the same time, not allowing people into certain aspects of your life and too personally. And so one of the things that I think about when we talk about toxic positivity is that we are not being the most genuine person that we can be when we are being toxic in our positivity. But there's also context, right? So there are times when it is more appropriate to have these conversations and times when it's less appropriate. And so thinking about kind of who those people are who are trusted confidants that we can talk to, and making sure that we find the appropriate context and time to have those conversations, and making sure that we're being that genuine person in those interactions. That's one way that we can combat that, because when we do that and we do those in the appropriate context, appropriate times, we can make sure that other people feel more okay or open to having those conversations as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like, I'm sorry, I feel like people always try to present the best version of themselves and just always try to show that highlight reel, whether it be like on social media or just kind of in general day to day. And I think if everyone makes the collective effort to just like say how they feel, and if everyone is doing that, we create a better environment for people to share and to seek help or just to work through things that they're struggling with.
I was interested, Jordan, on sort of like the male perspective. And, you know, so you're both in a, you know, like in football and in the military. I would think that there's, you know, you've talked a little bit about, you know, like pain and, you know, pushing through. So there's sort of like a wanting to portray strength, I think, in both those disciplines. And I just sort of wonder, it seems like there could be some tension between that, yet also being vulnerable enough to say, I'm not doing okay today.
There definitely is some conflict, and there has been. And I think it took me a while to find a way to navigate it in a way that felt like I was being true to myself, but also I was doing a good job of managing myself as an officer in the military. And so one of the things that I found is that I paid attention to the small things that people around me were doing, things that they were saying. And I found those people who I felt comfortable with and I thought would be the most receptive and the most, I guess, empathic when it came to me disclosing any difficulties I was experiencing. Particularly even this year. This year was a really tough year for everybody. And it was an extra rough year for me with certain things that went on, both in the military and in my personal life. And you know, I had certain people that I knew that if I went to them in their office, that I could have an open, genuine conversation with them. And there are people that I knew that I was never going to have those conversations with, and that was okay because I knew that that was not going to be appropriate for me to help me get what I needed from other individuals. And so that's kind of how I navigate it. It took me a while. It's tough because some of this, I guess the term toxic masculinity comes up a lot nowadays. But that lack of a desire to have those close interpersonal interactions and talk about the difficulties that we're experiencing, that's something that, you know, is very prevalent in football, very prevalent in the military. And, you know, it can be easy to fall into that because it's easier to not talk about things sometimes because you can just keep it in. But at the same time, it's not a healing experience, and it's not something that helps you to grow as a person.
Well, thank you all for sharing. My next question is, how has COVID uncertainty and challenges we're facing today shifted the way you view resilience within your own life, as well as when working with clients? Mac, would you like to start with this one?
Yeah. So I think back to Drive, my sophomore summer, back when Spaldo was teaching it. I know he's not around anymore, but it sounds like you guys still have Drive. So you're still participating in some of those experiences. But I distinctly remember him talking about defining resilience and, you know, having a steel beam and it bending, and resilience was its ability to come back to kind of its original shape. And I think about resilience with a distinct event, you know, there's a particular setback, then that steel beam maybe punches out and comes back to its original shape. But with something like COVID, where it's an ongoing process, it's more of this steady kind of pressure, right? And we don't know when it's going to end. We don't know when it's going to stop. We're, you know, figuring out how strong we are to balance it all and everything. But in that case, I don't see myself during COVID coming back to this straight line steel post. I see myself starting to adapt, starting to change my form, starting to find a new normal. And in doing so, trying to stay curious, trying to stay open-minded about, who I am and what I need to be happy, and what my routine needs to look like. Because if I was trying to hold on really tightly to, I need to be in this gym and I can only focus in the office, and I need X, Y, and Z factors in order to feel balanced and feel stable, well, I would kind of be out of luck right now, because it's just not going to happen. So redefining those parts of, what I need and how I can kind of find my needs met in different ways, and just trying to adapt rather than come back to where I was beforehand.
Yeah, I know, Sarah, you mentioned the other day when we talked about flexibility. So would you like to follow up on this one?
Yeah, I think, if we think about like the pandemic in particular, it's really frustrating, right? And we're all being thwarted in terms of things we want to do. We want to compete in our sport, or we want to be able to travel, or we want to be able to be with loved ones, or have a gathering where we have friends that are sitting right next to us, right? And so it's all about like, how can we cope with the frustration and being cognitively flexible, like having a plan B, having it not have to be a certain way, is going to make it easier for all of us. And that's easier said than done. And sometimes it's easier to say, well, I can sacrifice shopping at that grocery store, but I absolutely have to have this, and so I think with my clients and with myself, I'm trying really hard to think about, it's okay to grieve the loss of the experience that you had, but to try not to stay in that spot too long, acknowledge it, think about it, and then see what else you can think about something. So trying to have a more helpful thought. So I lost out on doing this thing that I thought was going to be incredibly important, or defining my year at Dartmouth. But, and then if you can fill in the blank after the but. And that's hard. And it's not to be Pollyanna, it's not to be artificial. And it sometimes might take quite a while. I mean, perspective is time and distance, right? So in the moment right now, it may not be clear what you're getting out of this experience, but I guarantee down the road, you're going to look back and think, wow, that's when this interest started, or wow, that's when I learned how to tolerate this emotion. So I guess that's what I've been thinking about in terms of flexibility, is just not having it have to be a certain way. If I can find another way to accept it. And I think, Jordan, you were saying it's a process, right? So it's not like you're resilient or you're not. It's the getting there that's the important part.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been thinking about during this time of pandemic, and about resilience, about my own resilience and people that I've worked with, is I've been transitioning from the definition of something, an object, a person going and being impacted by the stress of something and then returning back to its original form, and been thinking more about the definition of antifragile from Nicholas Taleb, right? So he talks about any complex system, whether it be a human being or an economic system, it requires some type of external stress on it for it to become strengthened, right? So humans are like that, right? So if we think about a person who is in a coma, sitting in a bed, right? They aren't able to move, aren't able to walk, aren't able to lift weights, aren't able to, and their body just atrophies. The muscle just gets eaten up and they get weaker. We require some type of stress on us to get better as a person, to get stronger, to develop. And so one of the ways that I've been thinking about resilience during COVID is that in order for us to get better as humans, we can utilize this time as that stressor, right? If we look at it as an opportunity to find new ways of being and new ways to grow and adapt, then we can develop as a person. So we require stress. Stress isn't bad. A lot of people are using terms like eustress nowadays, but we require this type of impetus on us to get better on some level. And it's usually not comfortable. It's not something that we enjoy, not something we want, but that's how we get better, right? You get in the gym, you lift weights because you want to get better. It may not feel good at the time, but on the back end, you know that you're going to get better. Similarly, I think that we can utilize this time to do so. And I found that learning to be better about being by myself and being okay with that, that's been a big part of it as well.
Yeah, that kind of leads into the next question. Do you have any examples or what you say to clients when they're in the midst of those challenges and those stresses? And I'll just put that, I guess I'll direct that at Jordan.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things, so with the work that I've been doing with special operations in the Air Force, what we do is we intentionally put our operators and future operators into highly stressful environments, because we know in the future they're going to be in situations where they may be killed or they are at a high risk of being killed, right? So they have to be able to deal with a high level of stress, and we intentionally put them in these types of stressful situations. So a concept that has been really helpful is the either challenge versus threat. Like, how can we look at something as a challenge versus a threat instead of a threat, something that is an existential threat, whether it be to our own existence or to our ego. But something that kind of has developed out of that is, rather than looking at something as a challenge, I think that an opportunity versus a threat mindset has been most helpful for the people I worked with. And so looking at these difficult situations as an opportunity to learn and grow and develop and get better in some way, versus looking at it as a threat, has been really helpful. So finding a way to look at these situations and say, okay, how can I use this? How can I take what I'm experiencing, learn from it, adapt to it, and find a way to be better on the back end? That's been a really helpful thing, both for myself and for a lot of people that I've worked with.
I would just add to that, maybe not a contrary thought, but also just the idea, I think when I'm with a client who's struggling, is like, we're doing the best we can, And I read this somewhere, I can't remember, but everybody was in the beginning, like we were all learning how to knit and make bread, and we were going to write our novels and whatever. And some of that those are all opportunities, but that may be a little unrealistic too, right? And so some days I think we just have to say, you know what, I made it through the day and I'm still here and I'm okay. And tomorrow's another day, and I can look to do some of those things when I've got more bandwidth for it. But I think to be kind to ourselves and to be kind to other people. And sometimes it might mean relaxing some of those standards that we've set for ourselves, like how many reps you're going to do of something, or how far you're going to run, or, I think you have to just take care of yourself too.
Absolutely. I think that, when I think about growth, I think about it from a holistic standpoint. So even being kinder to yourself, right? That is an area of growth. If you're super hard on yourself, a high achiever, and you're really hard on yourself when you don't perform at a certain level, right? Being more empathetic and more caring for yourself, that's growth, right? So growth can happen in a lot of areas, in a lot of ways in our life. And so it's how we look at what's going on in our life and what we're doing that determines whether or not we're growing in some ways.
Mac, would you like to share your experience with this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on with some of these comments that process of going from threat to opportunity is so important, but not to be assumed that it's a switch, that is a process like we've been iterating throughout this conversation, and giving yourself that grace, that kindness that isn't always natural to the high achieving athlete mindset, but giving yourself the patience to go through that process and just being aware that it is a process. I think for me, so often it was like, oh, I'm supposed to just turn that light on and move into that area, and then being confused with why I couldn't. So sometimes just that awareness is huge.
Yeah, and I think this kind of leads into my next question, which is building mental toughness or resilience is crucial for so many areas of life. As athletes, we work extremely hard training our bodies to perform in the gym or on the ice or on the field. Why do you think psychological training isn't something we think of when we think of our general training? Jordan, would you like to take this one on? Because I know it's a little bit different with the Air Force, but
It is and it isn't. So the Air Force actually was like a late adapter in terms of mental performance and mental skills training. So the Army and the Navy have been doing it for a much longer time. We just started adapting this. But one of the things that I think about is that, we live in a culture where we want returns on our investments very quickly. We want to, we work out and we get relatively quick returns and pretty visible and pretty easily measurable returns, right? You lift more weight, you run longer, you run faster. Those things are a lot easier to see and easier to measure. When it comes to mental training and mental skills, they tend to be much more abstract and they tend to be less easy to measure on an objective level. And I think that's part of it. But I think also, sport and performance psychology is in an interesting place in that I think it's lagged behind the other areas of psychology because of the way that research has been done in sports psychology. But also, there's a lot of stigma still when it comes to just generally pursuing psychological services, right? So there's still a lot of stigma when it comes to dealing with mental health issues in general. And I don't think that sport and performance psychology has separated itself enough that there isn't a stigma at all, because a lot of times you're dealing with a mental performance coach or even a psychologist, and there tends to be still that connection between mental skills training and psychology. And so I think that's part of the reason why it's lagged behind. But I think the lack of clear and demonstrable gains that people may experience, I think that's part of the reason why it's lagged behind.
Yeah, for sure. I also think that usually in athletes, when they think of psychological training, they just think of that performance based, like, okay, I want to visualize this game, I want to visualize scoring a goal and all that stuff. And it's all go, go, go. It's performance based. It's like, I need an outcome. Whereas, like, we don't really think about just kind of that day to day, like, oh, maybe I struggle falling asleep. Maybe I have anxiety. Maybe I'm feeling sad, have depression. And I feel like just kind of creating that space where that's normal to work on that is just a really huge thing. Mac, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jordan touched on some of my biggest thoughts around this. Obviously, the culture and the stigma that does still exist. I love seeing that that's being challenged a lot more right now. The quantifiable measures piece as well, and some of the history of how sports science and then sports psychology has progressed. When people first started looking at sports and what it meant to be, what excellence meant in sports, they're looking at all those physical aspects. What kind of build makes you a really good athlete, etc. And it took quite a while for the field to get to this point where it was starting to understand that where the way your mind is working is having an impact as well. And even now, as someone who is really passionate about sport culture and trying to pull on a lot of this information and studies and research, there's not a ton out there that's showing that link between the mental skills or even the personal development towards performance. And that's what sports wants to see right now in order to put the money and the time and the resources towards a lot of those things. And so the piece I want to add to Jordan's is the incentive systems that our athletic culture has. And a lot of them are, financially driven based on quantifiable measures. So take, for example, a coach holds their job so long as a program is defined as being successful. Well, how are we defining success for that program? It's XYZ wins. And if a coach is feeling the pressure of their job, their livelihood, their family, their lifestyle, riding on the performance of their team, well, what are they going to encourage for their team? Likely more commitment, more reliance on time in their sport and participating in it, and potentially not some of these abstracts and not entirely sure how they connect to performance resources, because the science and the literature is not being shown to them in the way it is for the physical performance aspect. That being said, there's some really cool literature coming out showing that we have these different aspects to ourselves as an athlete. We have our physical development and our personal development, and we have our time during sport as an athlete. We have our whole life during sport, and then we have our life after sport. And so if you can imagine our personal development line connecting to our life during sport, who we are, our entire life, the whole 360 view, and that then being connected to our performance, well, that is one of the first lines that we're able to show as to how our personal development skills and resilience and our mental toolbox is starting to translate to our performance. And of course, that line draws all the way back to transition and our post-athlete experience, which I think right now is a really underappreciated aspect of the athlete experience. Right now, we're kind of saying that being an athlete stops when your name is off the roster. And in all reality, we're going through a lot of the processing of who we are and our athletic identity 1 to 2 to 3 to many years after we've been an athlete. And so in my mind, I firmly believe that the athlete experience starts from youth sports and goes to, several years after our competitive careers.
Yeah, and I know you guys mentioned the stigma around just kind of seeking help, and I'm just kind of wondering, what is one way we can promote conversation and break this stigma around mental health and mental illness? And Sarah, would you like to take this one?
Sure. I mean, I so rarely use the term mental illness because I think it's just a loaded term, and it lumps everything all together and all symptoms and all diagnoses, and I prefer thinking of just kind of wellness overall and not drawing a huge distinction between physical or emotional wellness because they're so intertwined, right? If you experience a bad scare, you're going to feel it both emotionally and physically, right? And so I think the more we can just talk about it and be open about it, and people who are in leadership roles can model when they're not feeling well and how what they're doing to cope with it. So that if we can make coping sort of an external process, that's not just internal and mental and nobody sees it, but people talk about a time when they felt anxious and how they coped with it, or talked about a time when they felt depressed or homesick and what helped. I think that gives people permission to talk about it. I love that, like Michael Phelps has, the public service announcement about getting therapy. I think that's helpful. So when people we see and admire are open about their own struggles with it, it's just so incredibly common. And so I think when we talk about like mental illness, it's sort of like it's an other, it's a them that's suffering from that. When really at any time in our lives, we're all going to have times when we're not doing as well. And I think of it less as sort of like an on-off switch, you have it or you don't. I feel like it's much more a degree of symptomatology. So you may not have enough symptoms for someone to check all the boxes and call it, clinical depression, but you might have a lot of those symptoms or have it some of the time and not all the time. So I think trying not to make it so clear, so black and white, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't think that's a helpful distinction for people.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that one of the biggest problems that we have is that with the movement to be able to categorize and create this diagnostic statistical manual that we use, we have over pathologized a lot of experiences in this life. So I think moving away from a pathological model and talking about problems in living, we all have problems. We all need people. We need people in our lives to help us with those problems. Some of those people may be friends or family. Some of those people may be mental health professionals or performance coaches or something like that. And so I think moving further away from focusing on pathology and talking about just that people have issues in life, and we are social creatures. We need other people to help us to live our best lives, and learning to focus more on those types of living issues can be helpful to destigmatize this thing that we call mental wellness or emotional wellness.
And I think we have time for one more question. And so just to end this panel, during the Female Athlete Body Project, we did this exercise where we wrote a letter to a hypothetical young girl in our respective sports. And I thought it was a great way to just kind of take a step back, see how far you've come, and recenter yourself around this big picture of life, because usually when we're so focused on a particular goal, we end up in this tunnel vision mindset. And so what advice would you give to your past self as an athlete at Dartmouth and in general? And Jordan, I guess we'll start with you.
I think the the piece of advice that I would give myself is really to be patient with myself. Really, that's kind of the biggest thing, is that I think that um, because the process wasn't something that I was focused on for much of my career. I was focused on playing time. I was focused on, you know, you know, production on the field. But being patient with myself with the process that I was going through and experiencing, with all the injuries and things that I had, I think that would have been the thing that I told myself, because I think that would have helped me to just enjoy all of my athletic experience that much more. I loved it, but I would have enjoyed it that much more. That would be the one piece of advice I'd give myself.
Mac, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. When you asked the question, I guess the first thing that I thought of was like, tell myself to chill out and find balance. I was so just drilled into, student athlete, but usually athlete came before student, and trying to put all the extra hours in and keep the grades up, obviously, but just prioritizing all the little extras in the gym and everything. And in the long run, like, I'd had my value tied up so much in the numbers on, on the weight rack, or how fast I could skate, or all these little details that don't really make up the essence of who I am and the value that I bring to the world. And so I guess um, in summary, would have wanted myself to challenge those ideas more, and to kind of put into question, like, where did those come from, and why are you holding on to them so tightly, that is your worth and that is your identity? Because if you can challenge those, and you can explore them, and you can find where they came from, you can start to rewrite them, and you can start to find something that is going to be more true to you and serve you in the long run. So I wish I had come across that mindset a lot earlier on, but grateful I eventually got there.
And lastly, Sarah.
I would tell myself to get more sleep. I did not get a ton of sleep at Dartmouth, and I think I caught colds all the time. And I think I know now, 30 years on, like, how important sleep is to reset your system, both physically and emotionally. So if I could have had all the fun I had, but also gotten like much more regular and healthy sleep, I think that would have been, I don't know, probably life altering. I think, so I was a volleyball player, and I vividly remember when we were trying to become a little bit more professional, and we got new uniforms that were essentially like Lycra underwear, green Lycra. Imagine yourself getting up and performing in front of people wearing green Lycra underpants. And I'd had like that under a tennis skirt or under a hockey kilt, but field hockey kilt, but never like there was a level of exposure that I really worried a lot more about, like, what my body looked like than what my body could accomplish. And I think if I could have focused on, like, you are strong and you can jump and you can bend and you've got big, strong legs, there would have been, I think, a greater level of comfort. Fortunately, now they wear longer Lycra shorts. So, but I think as a female athlete, I think we do a lot of comparing ourselves to other people's bodies and trying to achieve things that sometimes aren't in our genetics, And so I think appreciating you for who you are and loving that body you have, and how well it works, you're in the prime of your youth, I think is important.
Well, it looks like we're out of time, but I want to say thank you to our panelists. This was a great conversation, and thank you to our viewers. And I guess that's it.
Thanks for having us.